It's good to be back in Massachusetts, so thank you for having me, Jim, and to the Pioneer Institute for sponsoring this. For many of you, you may not know it, but I actually lived in Massachusetts for about 8 years, and while authoring Disrupting Class, had the nice counsel of Representative Brownsberger by our side with me and Clayton as we were working on it to give us some feedback and tell us when we were way off base on a few things, which was a lot of fun. And then just as the book came out about a year later, my wife said, you know, I got a call from Napa, and California's a little bit warmer in January, so we ought to move out there. And I hate to say it, it was an attractive pitch. So we moved out to California and have been there for exactly 4 years. But it's always nice to get back to Massachusetts. We suspect we'll be back here at some point. So it's always a real pleasure to be here. And it's always a pleasure to get to speak after Julie, not only because she says a message that just resonates with where we see the future of education and where it needs to be in this student-centric place, but also she always has such poignant comments, and I thought she echoed it in her talk today, but it was in the preface to the report that you all got also today, which was really quite important, which is think about what problem you're trying to solve when you tackle this. For entrepreneurs out there, school leaders, teachers, policymakers, think about the problem you're solving, because there's a lot of hype right now to go online for online's sake or to go blended for blended's sake. In fact, yesterday was the second annual Digital Learning Day, and I was in Albany, New York, where I was speaking, and I was preceded by the Associate Commissioner of Education there, who said, please don't digitize learning. We don't need to put our failed system right now up on the web. What we need to do is actually digital learning, where we're giving every child the opportunity that they need to succeed in reaching them in the way that works for them. And it's a profound difference there, but really thinking about that problem statement I think is really important. So what I thought I would do today is just briefly talk through broadly the theories from our book that sort of launched this. Clay Christensen and I came from a very different perspective to public education, which was to apply these theories of innovation that had been so successful in so many sectors at making innovation a far more predictable and successful process. And so I'm just going to briefly ground the conversation in that theory of disruptive innovation, fully aware that disruption is a pretty terrible word to use around educators and in classrooms. There are a lot of people that when this book came out thought it was my biography. But to the middle school teachers out there, I assure you, I didn't think of it that way at all. But I'll start there, and so I'm going to give some examples from industries way outside of education, and then we'll turn and pivot and talk about how does it apply to K-12 education and what we see as this innovation that has this transformational potential, how it's playing out right now, both in full-time virtual learning as well as the myriad of blended learning models we're seeing across the nation, and then finish up with a conversation about what does it mean for policy perspective and what are we seeing across the country coming down in policies to think about what it means for Massachusetts specifically. So I'll dive in with that. And what I want you to think about when we think about disruptive innovation is a process that transforms a sector characterized by things that are expensive, complicated, deeply centralized and inaccessible into things that are way more affordable, convenient, simple to use, and far more accessible so that they can reach and serve many, many more people. So what I've done up here on the PowerPoint is I have a series of concentric circles. And what I want you to imagine is that innermost circle represents those people who have the most expertise or wealth in a sector. And as you go out each successive circle, it represents people who have comparatively less expertise or less wealth. And what we see in every industry is that when it starts, there's this great centralizing force in the middle with products and services that are so expensive and centralized that it can only serve those people in the middle. And then through the process of disruptive innovation, it decentralizes the world again so that everyone can participate. So it happened in the computing industry. Before the advent of the first mainframe computer in the 1940s, we all, if we wanted to do computing, sort of hovered around in these outer circles, and we'd whip out our slide rule whenever we wanted to do some computations. And that worked just fine for a while. And then it was the advent of the mainframe computers by IBM that literally centralized this computing industry in the center. For those of you that remember the mainframe computers, remember it cost a couple $1 million to own a mainframe computer, right? These things were huge. They literally filled an entire room. And so in order to have access to computing, you had to bring your problems to the computing center where the expert engineers would run the computing task for you. Now, there's this disruptive innovation in Massachusetts, where the Digital Equipment Corporation led in the 1970s and 80s, really, in the form of what they called the mini computer. For those of you, again, that remember, the mini computer wasn't that mini. It was about the size of this podium here. But compared to the mainframe that would fill an entire room, right, it was mini. And it was only $250,000. Still sounds kind of expensive, but it enabled relatively more people to have access to this technology. Now, the real disruptive innovation that really changed the game was the advent of the personal computer, right, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. How many people remember those early personal computers? This is a very honest audience. I appreciate that. So if you remember clacking away on those early machines and the word processing programs, you remember how frustrating those things were in the beginning? You had to stop every once in a while and coax the stupid thing to catch up with your fingers. It was a primitive machine, right? But the companies that sold the early personal computer did so for just a couple $1,000s. And these things were portable, basically, right? They would come on your desktop. And so for people that couldn't have access to those deeply centralized mainframe and mini computers, now the computing came to you at your fingertips. And so this is way better than the alternative for many people, which was nothing at all. And true to form, every disruptive innovation, it starts in a simple application and gets better year over year over year, such that the people in the center start to flock out to those outer circles because they're delighted with something that's good enough, that's way more affordable, convenient, and accessible for them. And we've seen this process continue to play itself out. With the laptops, I'm betting most of you do not have desktop computers anymore, netbooks, tablets, and of course the smartphones that you're all carrying around today. And if you get particularly bored of me in a couple minutes, you can whip out and become productive again. But the nice thing about those smartphones that started so primitive, if you remember the 1980s with the first cell phones, was that you literally have more computing power in your pocket than existed on the entire face of this earth some 60 years ago, combined. You literally have more computing power in your pocket than sent the first man to the moon. Just think about how much progress that represents. And we've seen this play itself out in industry after industry. What I have here is 3 columns, and they're sort of in the blue. You can imagine the companies whose stock we wish we had owned the previous couple of decades, who were disruptive to those companies in the red. And then in the green are those that we might look to for disruption tomorrow. And you can tell a story around every single one of them. In the automotive industry, the Japanese automakers disrupted the Detroit automakers through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? Now, by the time the game was really up in the last few years, the Detroit automakers have quite literally had to reinvent themselves. But interestingly enough, Toyota has been being disrupted over the last several years by the Korean car companies, Kia, Hyundai, and so forth, that if we had met here 10 years ago, everyone would have sort of laughed at the quality and discounted them. And now if you look, they own the subcompact and compact ends of the market. They're starting to win all the quality awards. And they're even running commercials where they're saying, isn't it time someone did to Lexus what Lexus did to Mercedes? Taking dead aim. Now, underneath them are the Chinese and Chery, who I'm sure we don't need to worry about. But you see how this process plays itself out. Department stores used to be 300 plus full-service department stores across this country. There are about 7 or 8 left. And discount retail, Walmart, Kmart, and Target have been disruptive to them over the last several decades. Now, the interesting thing, if you've been paying attention, is that Target has itself improved and gone up market. They now call themselves Target. And online retail is coming up underneath them. Does anyone know who powers Target.com? Just yell it out if you do. Amazon, yeah, exactly. Amazon.com actually powers Target.com. So we see that coming up consistently. We can tell the story in higher education, too. You wouldn't say that community colleges are actually disruptive to state universities for a variety of reasons, but they were decentralizing. They allowed many more people access to higher education than had it before. And online universities have actually been disruptive and are growing 20% a year as a class, and we're seeing the next wave of disruption over the last year or two in competency-based, low-cost universities, and potentially the massive open online courses that, if you believe the New York Times, are literally going to change higher education yesterday. They may take a few years, but we're starting to see massive disruptive innovations. And as we turn to K-12 education, the observation we made was that online learning, broadly speaking, had that same transformational impact in K-12 education. It was a little hard to figure out where those areas would be initially, though, when we're talking about the American schooling context. If you think internationally, where those areas where there's literally nothing and people would welcome online learning to come in, you can actually see that there's huge areas where people would be just delighted for this, because in the developing world, there are literally 70 million students worldwide, would-be students, that have no access to primary school. 200 million students worldwide who literally have no access to secondary school. So for them, online learning in a blended arrangement of some sort that allowed them to have access to great teachers, you can see how that might be a really interesting proposition. But in America, where schooling is largely compulsory, it wasn't clear where these areas of non-consumption would be. And yet if you look actually at the level of courses themselves, the classes inside of American education, particularly at the high school level, but everywhere, you actually see that there's lots of areas of non-consumption where these disruptive innovations can get their start. And so we can tell a story through each of these where online learning has gotten its start and started to grow. Julie actually referenced several of them in her remarks when she was getting asked to take on all of these things by the state of Florida, because these were areas where the existing system had no interest or no capacity to be serving students, and so they were just delighted to give it to an online learning entity that could start doing these things. Credit recovery, dropout recovery being huge problems, of course, across the country. AP and advanced courses being particularly pernicious ones in rural areas across our country. You know, I'll just tell briefly, advanced placement courses are sort of well known that there's 34 and that there's no school that's able to offer all the AP courses. But the story is actually far bleaker than that. 26% of high school students in 2007 attended a high school that offered literally no advanced courses, period. Defined as anything above geometry, so no algebra 2, no calculus. Defined as anything above biology, so no chemistry, no physics. And we're talking about dealing with STEM crises across this country. Defined as anything that's an honors English class, period. Now, I guarantee you there were students in those schools that wanted access to those classes and needed them. So this is where online learning has gotten its start. And what's interesting is that the budget crises and teacher shortages that have been sweeping through the country have actually been increasing some of these areas of non-consumption and allowing people to innovate in different ways over the last several years. Now, the question, of course, is online learning, in fact, planting itself in this way? And our observation is that it is. Whenever a disruptive innovation enters the market, it follows this S-curve pattern. That is, in the early years, it's not all that great. It gets its start. People iterate quite rapidly. And at some point, they turn the corner, and people rapidly adopt that S-curve, and then it levels off at the top when it's saturated the market, if you will. The challenge is, if you're on that early part of that S-curve, how do you know if one's actually developing? It could be a straight line to nowhere. It could be a relatively flat S-curve, or, slow moving, or a fast one. And it turns out, I'm not going to go into the mathematics right now, but that if you put it on a logarithmic scale, the percent of the new technology divided by the percent of the old, when the market's just 1, 2, 3, 4%, if an S-curve is indeed developing, it linearizes that S-curve such that you can project when it'll hit 25, 50%, 80%, and so forth. Now, what's interesting, when we wrote Disrupting Class, we did these projections on the growth of homeschooling, which has been very rapid across this country for several years now. And an S-curve does not develop. It flattens out for full-time virtual schools and homeschooling today at about 10% of students is what the projection shows, which means that's the maximum number of students that could possibly contemplate a homeschooling experience, suggesting that 90% of students are going to continue to go to school. But what's interesting is that an S-curve did develop in online courses at the high school level. leading us to make this crazy prediction that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion. Now, when the book came out in 2008, everyone said we were sort of crazy, that schools could never change that fast. And then the financial crisis hit, and about 6 months later, Julie remembers this, everyone came back to us and said that they were still crazy, but now they said we were too conservative with our prediction. I kind of plead the fifth on this. I think we'll be right within a couple years on either side, but I actually think it misses the point. Because the bigger opportunity is to address this, which is what Julie was talking about, which is to transition to a student-centric system that can address this thing that we've all known for a long time, which is that all of us have different learning needs at different times, which of course is exactly why I'm lecturing right now. Now, there's been a ton of academic food fights over what these differences are over the last several decades. This is just sort of a representation of some of the food fights in academia. But what's interesting is that no one disagrees on a few dimensions of what these differences are among students. We know that every child learns at different paces. Not just every child, but all of us. We learn at different paces. Some people grab onto material really quickly and just swallow up some subject matter. Other people have to grapple with something a little bit more slowly and really wrestle it until they master it. You notice that the tortoise does beat the hare, though, there. Now, not only that, but a key reason for the fact that we learn at different paces is that we have different aptitudes, or what cognitive scientists call working memories. We literally can absorb different amounts of information through our different sensory mechanisms at a time and manipulate it. And on top of that, we all bring different levels of background knowledge into a learning experience. We all have different amounts of knowledge in our long-term memory. And the result of all of this is that if our goal is now to educate every single child successfully, then we need to break out of this system that was literally built to standardize the way it teaches and tests. This factory model system that was built to batch students up in classrooms and add value to them in the same way on the same day. We have to escape to a student-centric system that can customize for each child and have that learning experience of one that Julie talked about, and be able to allow for those collaborations when it makes sense, but for the child and based on the child's needs. And the cool thing about online learning is that because it's inherently modular and can rapidly bring in feedback cycles and allow people to move at different paces and pathways, is that it inherently allows for the student-centric experience in its best form. This is a screenshot from the Khan Academy. How many people are familiar with the Khan Academy? So most everyone. So this is a classic case where if you're not familiar with it, I'm about to move on, and you're going to get really upset and hang on to that concept and lose my bigger point here. But so the Khan Academy offers math lessons at the moment and a lot more, actually. But this is a screenshot from a 5th grade classroom where this online blended learning experience was adopted in California. And what you can see is the learning trajectories of all the students in that classroom. And the student highlighted in blue, actually, if we were to hone in there on day one, started 3rd to the bottom in the class. So in the traditional system, that student would have been labeled a slow learner, put in a particular class, and left to sit there throughout the rest of the year, right? And then that child would never have gone into, probably hit algebra until 9th grade instead of 8th grade, and we can imagine what that would do to that trajectory. Now, because the system is modular, this child was able to accelerate. And it was just a few concepts were stopping them up. You can see where they get stymied throughout that learning trajectory and break out. And at the day 70 mark here of this screenshot, the child was 3rd from the top in the class. By the end of the year, this child was doing high school math as a 5th grader. Literally, this was education malpractice in the old system that we can now break out of. Now, the question is, will online learning realize this student-centric potential? Here, I think, is the interesting question, not the growth, but on the student-centric piece. I think there's evidence on both sides. The positive evidence is that, like technology and every other application we've studied, it's predictably improving. If we'd come here 5 years ago and talked about online learning, most people probably would have had distance learning in their minds, but increasingly, online learning is snapping itself into these brick-and-mortar school environments to create these blended learning environments where the majority of students are spending their time. And so as a result, everyone sort of has their different definition of blended learning. We've been doing a lot of research in which we've looked at a lot of school models with blended learning and talked to over 100 educators to put out a definition of blended learning that the International Association of K-12 Online Learning has adopted. And it basically has two components to it. And then I'll suggest a third at the end of this that I think we're going to change and add to it. The first is it's a formal education program in which a student is learning at least in part through online delivery of content and instruction. And this is the critical part, where there's some element of student control over the time, the place, the path, and or the pace of learning. So that's basically online learning with that student control meets learning at least in part in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home, so basically school. So online learning, school. And then the third part I'd add is that to the extent students are learning in different modalities, that data connects those different experiences. So if a child's learning in small group instruction in the classroom and then hops online, what they've done in one should inform where they are in the other so that they're not just repeating themselves and pace becomes a meaningless thing. Now, importantly, what this definition precludes is that blended learning is not simply putting an electronic whiteboard or a smartboard at the front of a classroom and lecturing through beaming online curriculum. So what we're doing right now, not blended learning, right? We haven't changed the pedagogy where a student actually has control over that time, place, path, and pace. Similarly, implementing one-to-one laptops or digital textbooks in and of themselves, while they may be enablers to blended learning, just the mere introduction of this technology does not mean you're doing blended learning. And that's a really important part of this. We've spent a lot of money on this country equipping schools with computers and technology and just layering over the existing system and not actually doing blended learning. Now, blended learning, despite that, has a lot of different varieties to it. I'm not going to go through the entire taxonomy today. This is a really ugly looking chart with what they are, but I'll just quickly summarize it. At the top, you got brick and mortar schools meets online learning, and they basically have a baby, which is blended learning in the third line. Now, on the four things there in the middle, in yellow, are things that are not blended learning. Things like traditional instruction, tech-rich instruction, informal online learning, full-time online learning, okay? And there's four different models you can see, broadly speaking, of blended learning. We can get into this later if we want in the Q&A, but right now I'm going to pass over it, okay? We're just seeing a lot of different flavors of this, and the purpose of putting this taxonomy forward was to give educators a way to talk about what they were doing compared to what someone else was doing so that we didn't have to say mine's blended learning and yours isn't. Instead, we could start to get more meaningful about how does it change the experience for the student, why did you choose that design as opposed to this one, and so forth. I thought I'd give a couple examples of what these look like on the ground. This is Carpe Diem schools, which is originated in Yuma, Arizona, recently opened in Indianapolis, Indiana this year. It's in an individual rotation model. Literally in a rotation model, students are rotating between different modalities, one of which is online learning, on a fixed schedule. What's unique about the individual rotation model that I thought I'd showcase here is that every single child has an individualized playlist. So while they're rotating between different experiences every 35 minutes, if a student needs to stay in the same experience for multiple times, then they will. So if they have to just keep going online, then they will. What's cool about it is when you walk in, actually I'll show some pictures. When you walk in, this is actually what you see, a huge learning lab where every student has their own office. And you can't see it in that picture, but every single student decorates it based on what they want to be when they grow up. Now, one child, when they started, they said that they wanted to be a Walmart greeter. So what the school did was actually take the child to Walmart and observe the Walmart greeter for an entire day and figure out what are the skills and experiences that you like so much and what other careers might actually be interesting about that. And that was part of the really exciting part. And what happens is that as students get stuck or so forth, there's teachers roving around the learning lab with real-time data who are observing what's going on, and they can dive in and actually mentor and help students and so forth. For a while, they'll leave students on their own to struggle with something, because that's important too. But eventually they'll dive in when it's important and so forth. And then there's breakout rooms around the perimeter that are glassed off, that aren't classrooms at all, where students can get small group instruction, do rich project-based learning and so forth. That gets pretty exciting. one more thing out of Silicon Valley Flex Academy, which is a flex model because it's pretty neat as well. And this is a very different model, but it's similar to the individual rotation. The difference is now students just flexibly and fluidly move between experiences as it makes sense for them. And that's where you really start to get some exciting dynamic things going on. And as you can see from that, you totally change the architecture of what is school, which actually has a whole bunch of implications for regulations and so forth about where schooling can be and can't be. Now, the couple other ways that online learning is improving, and then I'll jump into the policy set. The second dimension is that the communication vehicles are becoming far better. This is a screenshot from a virtual classroom, but how many people here use Skype? Just curious by show of hands. Almost everyone. So you all know that the ability to communicate by video ubiquitously with anyone, anywhere in the world for free is basically here. Just a quick question, how many people used AOL Instant Messenger about 6, 7, 8 years ago when it used to be out? Okay, so show of hands. So I worked for them, so I can make fun of what I'm about to say. Anyone ever try to click the video chat button on the side? Anyone? Raise your hand if you tried. You did. It probably failed, right? Oh yeah, quickly. Sorry about that. Just think about how, that was 2004. Think about how quickly we've come since then. And with touch screens and 3D screens coming on the horizon, who knows where communication is going to be 10 years from now. The other thing that's getting better is we're learning how to create engaging and intrinsically motivating content that does not distract from the learning experience itself. So this is a screenshot from the Florida Virtual School of the first ever video game-based full high school course. In this case, it was an American history course called Conspiracy Code. And if I'm not mistaken, students in it ran 10 missions to save American history from becoming corrupted. Some of you may joke that it's too late, but now, Florida Virtual School did some interesting stuff here. They did a ton of research on this, both looking at student outcomes as well as how it actually changed the brain based on waves and functional MRI scans and so forth. And they saw some interesting things, which was it was tremendously efficacious for lots of students, but it also didn't work for every child. And that actually was a victory. That's the point, right? That we can find these customized pathways for different students based on their needs. The other thing they saw was it wasn't for every teacher either. Certain teachers really could teach in a game-based environment, and others couldn't. And that, too, is the point, to be able to provide differentiated career pathways. Now, here's the question where I'm really worried about whether it'll hit student-centric future or not, which is in the policy landscape. The biggest thing is whenever you see a disruptive innovation come out, is to not be beholden by the old metrics on which you judge the old system. We can imagine that if you judge the personal computer by the metrics you judge the mainframe, that it wouldn't have looked terribly good. And if you kept saying, you got to be bigger, that what you would have gotten would not have been what you had hoped for out of the original value proposition. Same thing here. Our school system historically has been judged based on inputs and processes. We need to get beyond that to focusing on student outcomes, and I would add with a particular eye for individual student learning growth itself. The biggest policy thing in my mind is that second bullet point there, which is to escape from a seat time system into a competency-based learning system. Julie talked about the ability to start and stop whenever it makes sense. I asked her once, how many students do you have in summer school? And she looked at me really confused because they said, you don't really think of it that way, Michael, with all due respect to your old frame of reference. But literally for the last 100 years, we've been measuring the wrong end of the student. Think about it for a second. And we have to get beyond that to a competency-based learning system, which I'll talk more about in a moment. Standards are super important in this world because they enable customization, but standardization of process is incredibly inhibiting to innovation. And you see the other ones there. The second big broad set of bullet points applies pretty sharply to Massachusetts. The first one is at some point snapping to a self-sustaining funding formula where dollars follow the students is critical. Florida Virtual School did something very smart early on in its history, which was it had a line item appropriation for supplemental courses, but at some point they made the switch to where dollars could actually follow students down to the online course so it could grow organically and with demand. That's a really critical piece of this. The other piece of it is that they're based on outcomes. Now, I wouldn't go as far as Florida here. I think that this is a shortcoming in the state framework. Florida gets paid 100% based only when the student successfully completes the course. That doesn't quite incentivize innovation. I would do something a little more balanced, like what Utah or Louisiana has done, where they do 50% up front and 50% on the back end. But tying it to student outcomes to put the incentives in the right place, particularly if you have end-of-course exams that can be taken on demand as students finish courses, is unbelievably important to put the emphasis on the right things. The other piece here is having a marketplace of choices, which Louisiana and Utah have done very well in the supplemental course piece, and other places have done well in full-time virtual schools, and the policy that was passed and signed by Governor Patrick did a big step forward in doing this. What I would say is that the way it's been maybe interpreted in the immediate year is still a little limiting because it's only allowing one provider to jump into that fray. So being very clear about having a marketplace of choices to create competition around student outcomes is critical, and so multiple authorizers may be a critical piece of that. The last couple things I'll say, Julie talked about professional development. I totally agree. I would say don't require professional development from an innovation perspective, but to give autonomy down to the school leaders themselves to figure out how to spend dollars, what mix between instructional on-the-ground resources with students and what mix for their teachers makes sense, because every single blended learning model needs radically different things, and so to try to legislate that one size fits all is just very challenging. But it's critical that teachers have support, and so thinking through different roles for teachers and giving people autonomy to do that is important. The broadband wireless infrastructure, Julie mentioned this, but it's important. 80% of our schools nationwide literally do not have the speed that they need to provide these types of experiences. And so that's a critical part of it. I'll end here with just one set of graphics, which is that today we have an education system where we deliver content to students. We then test and assess, and we let students progress to the next grade, subject, or body of material regardless of their results. In fact, they get the results afterward, after they've already progressed. This is the seat time system, the factory model system where you move on regardless. And so we have to assess to figure out the autopsy after students have left our system, how many % of them failed in essence. A competency-based learning system flips this around, so time becomes the variable and learning becomes the constant. We offer learning experiences for students. We still test and assess because that's a critical part of this, and accountability is very important, and Massachusetts has been a leader here. But instead of just moving students on, regardless of how they've done, we get almost real-time interactive feedback, which we use to inform what students do next. And only after they've truly mastered something do they progress to the next body or subject of material. Flipping on that on its head is absolutely critical. And it's allowing us to create that future education where every child can have what they need when they need it. And it's one that Massachusetts, as a leader in so much else in education, clearly can grab onto here. So I'm excited to be here with you all and excited for the panel that will follow as well. Thank you very much.